resumed.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, today we are starting a panel dealing with the topic of test fishing. And we have three new witnesses for you today. Mr. Jim Cave from the Pacific Salmon Commission, Mr. Paul Ryle from Fisheries and Oceans, and Mr. Brian Asu from, I'm going to Cape Mudge, but I know you've got a different name that I'll ask you to pronounce when you're introduced. So these witnesses all need to be sworn in, please.
This hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I so affirm. I do. I affirm.
Just state your full name, please.
My name is Jim Cave.
My name is Jim Cave.
My name is Paul Ryle. Brian Asu.
Thank you.
Thank you. And those mics, you need to be about 6 inches from them for people to hear you, so you may have to move them around as you answer. So thank you. I'll start with you, Mr. Cave. You work with the Pacific Salmon Commission currently,
That's correct.
and you worked at the previous commission starting in 1978. Is that right?
That's correct. That was the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission.
Okay. And have you been at the old commission and the new commission since '78?
Yes, that's correct. I started with the Pacific Salmon Commission in 1986.
Okay. And right now you are the head of stock monitoring at the Salmon Commission.
That's correct.
And just by way of introduction, what does that group do?
The stock monitoring group puts the test fishing program together, the Hell's Gate program together, and the hydroacoustics program together. We also have a role in analysis of all of those data in stock monitoring, and we do the fishery modeling work and run size estimation models.
Just confirm that that is.
Yes, that is my CV.
Okay, thank you. I'll have that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 363.
Mr. Asu, you have also provided a CV, and that's at tab 8 in the binder.
Yes, that's
Okay, and you are a counselor with the Weewakai, is that right?
Weewakai, yes.
Weewakai, and that is also related to the Cape Mudge Band, it's the same name?
That's right, same.
Same organization?
Yes.
All right. You have been a counselor since '85 with that First Nation?
That's correct.
All right. And you've been an alternate on the Fraser River panel of the Pacific Salmon Commission since 1992?
Yes.
And you're also involved with an organization known as Atlagay Fisheries Society?
Yes.
And what's that organization?
It's an organization that was formed to receive AFS funding in 1999, and it represents five bands: Weewakai, Weewakam, Comox, Clowitzies, and Kuyaka.
Okay. And previous to that, how long have you been involved in Atlagay?
Since the inception.
In '99?
Yes, that's
Okay.
right.
And there was an interval from 2002 to 2007. You were also the chair of the First Nations Marine Society?
That's correct.
Okay. And we will talk about that society a little bit today. You are also, since 1995, a test fisher for Fisheries and Oceans and the Salmon Commission, is that right?
Yes.
And where do you operate your vessel?
In Area 13.
Okay. In Johnson Strait?
Yes.
Okay. And have you also been involved with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board?
Yes, I have.
For how long?
About 6 years now, I think.
All right, I'd like Mr. Asu's CV to be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 364.
Thank you. And Mr. Ryle, I'll just take you to your CV. It's at tab 1 of the binder. And you've been with the department since 1986, is that right?
Since 1989.
89.
Before that, I worked for the Salmon Commission for a couple of years as well.
Okay.
Maybe that's what you were looking at.
Yeah. And you have a master's in natural resource management?
I do.
You were the area chief of resource management in the Lower Fraser from 99 to 2003?
Yes, part of that time it was the area chief for the Fraser River, which was the whole area. It was split into two areas, Lower Fraser and BCI, in about 2002, I think it was.
And you were the lead on the salmon team from 2003 to 2009?
That's correct.
Okay. You also have, were also the Canadian chair of the Fraser River panel for 5 years, 2004 to 2009?
It was about 4 years. It was from late 2004 and into 2009.
And while you were in that role, you were also the chair of the Fraser River Integrated Management Team, FRIMT?
That's correct.
Okay. And in 2006, you were a member of a group known within the department as the La Roque Working Group?
I was for a short period of time, about 3.5 months, I think it was, in 2006, the fall of.
The first document I'd like to go to is at tab 2. This is the policy for Fraser River panel authorized Fraser sockeye and pink salmon test fisheries. Yes?
Yes, it is, sorry.
That's okay. Were you involved in drafting this document?
I had some involvement, yes.
Okay. And this document sets out the policies under which the Salmon Commission carries out panel-approved test fisheries in both panel and non-panel waters. Is that right?
That's correct.
I'd like that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 366.
And this document also sets out the key elements of the test fishing program. It sets out the purpose of the program, and on the pages 2 and 3 sets out the key elements of the operations.
That's correct.
Okay. And just so that we've got some things to locate ourselves here, I just wanted to put the maps for the test fishing operations in front of you. If we can just take a second to get that document. Are there any changes to this map in terms of what's currently being operated as a test fishery?
The troll test fisheries indicated by X's in Canadian statistical areas 123 through 127 are no longer operated.
Okay, so that would be the X's in 127, 126, 124, and 123. Those are all not active at the moment?
That is correct.
Right, and as you can see on this map, it indicates different kinds of test fisheries: troll fisheries, gillnet, and seine, and those are the 3 kinds of marine test fisheries you run?
That is correct. There is I should add that there is a panel-approved test fishery in the U.S. Statistical Area 5, which is in Juan de Fuca Strait, and that is a small test fishery that's operated for a period of time until that commercial fishery starts operating.
Is that the reef net observations indication?
No, it's a gillnet test fishery in Area 5.
Okay. And if you could turn, Mr. Lund, to the next page in that document. RMS document exhibit 330 sets out the fisheries strategies that were employed in 2009. So I'm just putting this to you as an example of what happened in 2009. There is a schedule prepared every year that sets out what the test fisheries will be and what their start dates will be, and that's prepared in advance of the season. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, and this document for 2009 sets out all of the different test fisheries that the Salmon Commission will be running in that year.
That is correct. There is, yes, that is correct. Sorry.
And it shows start dates for the test fisheries and anticipated end dates. Are those fixed in stone, or is there some flexibility around those start dates?
We, as a starting point, we look at what we did 4 years earlier and modify them accordingly. But also, they reflect data needs, and some of these we don't change very often. The Area 20 gillnet typically starts in the last 10 days in June, somewhere in there, usually somewhere between the 20th and the 22nd. Now, if in the case of early Stewart sockeye there are specific conservation concerns, we will sometimes not run that test fishery. So it might start, and in some years has started, as late as July 14.
That's where you don't anticipate there being any fishery permitted at all on that run?
That's correct, and it just reflects a conservation concern that we would likely not we use the data for in-season management on such a small run size.
Okay.
And it's just any catch on that run is not necessary.
Okay. I'd like you to just go through the different fisheries, just to describe where they're located and just in an overview sense what they are, what they're comprised of, what they do. So starting with the gillnet fishery, where are those located, and what can you give us an overview of that program?
We have 3 marine gillnet test fisheries, one in Area 20, one in Area 4B, 5, and 6C. Actually, it's technically Area 5 in the U.S., and one at Round Island. Those are gillnet test fisheries.
And where's Round Island?
Round Island is in the vicinity of Port Hardy,
What area is it in?
statistical area 12, sub-area I don't recall. Those test fisheries run at night. Gillnet, Area 20 gillnet starts about 8 o'clock at night. They fish 2 sets with a 300-fathom net that's 90 meshes deep. Typically, the set times are from 8 until midnight, and then again from about 1 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the morning, depending on catch levels. In Area 12, they run between 3 and 4 sets a night at Round Island with a 200-fathom net that is 60 meshes deep. And again, they run from approximately 8 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock the following morning. Area 5 can run a broader duration depending on the nature of that fishery. But we still need the data as soon as possible in the morning, so we're typically getting that one wound up by about 9 in the morning. That's a longer net. I believe it's 550 fathoms. It's a very long net and quite deep, about 200 meshes deep, and that's a monofilament net. The seine fishery, we have 3 seine vessels that we have chartered. One fishes Canadian Statistical Area 20, one fishes Canadian Statistical Area 12, and another one fishes Canadian Statistical Area 13, and that is Brian Asou's area. In Area 20, we fish a what's called an outside seine net that is 8 3/4 strips in depth. It's a 300-fathom net. They fish six sets per day. Across an area, a location in Area 20 known as the Blue Line. In Area 12, again, we fish 6 sets per day in the vicinity of Blinkhorn, Robson Bight, at standard tie-off spots in Area 12. It's not at different depth intervals, it's at specific tie-off spots. And that is at using an inside seine net that I understand is 5.75 strips, and depending on, I believe there's a 25 mesh border on the bottom and a 50 mesh border on the top. Is that correct, Brian? A 50 mesh border on the bottom. Sorry. We've got the technical representative here and understands the gear better than I do. Those nets are the same for both 12 and 13, and similarly in Area 13, we fish 6 sets from approximately Chatham Point down to almost Browns Bay, I suppose. And those are standard tie-off spots as well. And if Brian wants to clarify the Area 13, he can.
I guess the only thing I would add, Jim, is from Ripple Point to just outside of Deepwater Bay.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. We also have 2 gillnet test fisheries in the Fraser River, one at Cottonwood, located near Dease Island in Area 29 in the Fraser River. That test fishery is primarily a stock composition test fishery. It fishes a variable mesh net that's 175 fathoms in length. Correction, 120 fathoms in length. And we also fish a variable mesh net at Wannock, and that's very near where the former Albion Ferry used to operate. That is primarily a species composition test fishery, but it also collects data for biological samples for stock ID as well. We have another test fishery that's experimental at this time that we operate during pink salmon years. Those are odd-numbered years, and that's at the Mission. And that is a combined drift net and set net test fishery that operates 3 days a week. And that's to provide information on species composition in the vicinity of the Mission hydroacoustic site. And finally, we have, not finally actually, there's a backup, there's a reef net program that collects observations in U.S. statistical area, Washington State statistical area 7, at 3 sites at Lummi Island, at Lummi Island, San Juan Channel, and another location at Harrow Strait at near the top end of San Juan Island. There's no fish that are caught during the course of the reef net observations. However, the test fishery there is paid for with pay fish that are taken again by another reef net operator. And finally, we have a troll test fishery that operates in Canadian Statistical Area 29, sub-areas 1 through 6, and that is targeted on late-run sockeye for estimation of potential delay of those stocks. Test fishery, which I will mention, it's Naka Creek that operates near Robson Bight in Canadian Statistical Area 12 for a handful of days in the year.
What kind of fishery is that?
It's a gillnet test fishery. It fishes a twisted monofilament Alaska, so-called Alaska twist, and it's 90 meshes deep.
Okay. Thank you. Just backing up a little bit on the gillnet fishery. Are any fish retained and sampled at the gillnet fisheries?
The gillnet fishery, all fish are typically killed as a consequence of running that fishery, and they're retained for samples, and those are used for stock ID, length and sex, and age composition, and yeah, that's the case in all of our gillnet test fisheries. They're all fish are sacrificed. In the case of the seine test fisheries, we limit our sample to between 100 and 150 fish a day, if possible. If we can get that many fish, generally we can. And there has also been the take of some sets in odd years, in pink years, to get species composition to confirm our estimates of catch of sockeye and pink salmon in those sets, but there's only a limited number of those, 2 or 3 a year.
And those are where you would keep the fisher would keep the whole set?
We keep the whole set, yes.
And with the gillnet fishery, are all of the fish sampled, or just a subset of the fish that are caught?
A subset of the fish that are caught, up to 115 fish for between 100 and 115 fish, depending on the type of sample required.
Okay. And where did the samples go?
The DNA samples are sent to the DNA lab at Nanaimo Biological Station, Terry Beecham's group.
Which is a Fisheries and Oceans lab?
That's a Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada lab, that's correct. And the scales come directly to our office.
So you do the scale sampling work in-house at Salmon Commission?
That's correct.
Is there an e-log system used in the seine fisheries?
Yes, there is, and also the Round Island and Naka Creek gillnet are also handled by e-log.
And what is the e-log system?
I'm going to let either Paul or Brian answer that, because I'm not as familiar with that program.
Just going back to test fisheries for a second, there's one other test fishery that's operated by DFO at Quaylark, which is just upstream of Hope, and it's run in conjunction with a hydroacoustic facility there as well that's operated for the last number of years. As far as the e-log system, it's a national program, and the intent is to gather information, biological information on test fisheries, or could be as well on commercial fisheries. So that information is entered into a database and is provided on a very timely manner. So there's gear that's put on to whether it be a test vessel or a commercial vessel to gather that information and transmit it. I don't know if Brian wants to add anything to that.
Is the program in areas 12 and 13 administered differently? I'm talking about, I guess, here about the seine fishery. Is the program in areas 12 and 13 administered differently than the seine fishery in area 20?
There are some differences that relate to the how the pay fish are handled there, how the fish are handled there and sold. In areas 20, all of the fish that are sold as a part of the biological samples are sold to the same buyer as the gillnet, and so we do deal with that buyer directly. The Pacific Salmon Commission does. In the case of area 12 and 13, seine and gillnet, the fisherman deals with the sale of those fish, but identifies what the sale of those fish are, and the amount of money that we would pay him after he has sold those fish would be adjusted accordingly.
Is the Department of Fisheries and Ocean more involved in the area 12 and 13 fisheries?
Yes, they are. The contracts are in our name. We handle the LAROC funds, which I believe Paul will speak to later, on behalf of those test fisheries. But the actual direction of the people of the individual test fishermen typically comes from the technicians based out of Nanaimo, Carmen McConnell, and Lee Keary.
Who are Fisheries and Oceans technicians?
They are Fisheries and Oceans technicians.
Right. And why is that? Why is the area 12 and 13 somewhat different and the DFO technicians are involved?
Well, they're the people most familiar with that test fishery, and they're the people that ran that entire program up until the LAROC, the change in procedure under LAROC, and so we're keeping them involved. And actually, they are involved. They continue to be involved, but we historically have administered. The Pacific Salmon Commission has historically administered the panel area waters test fisheries. And the Department of Fisheries and Oceans historically administered the non-panel area water test fisheries. And just some of the changes that have come about because of the requirements under LAROC.
Okay, so that's really the distinction, is that area 12 and 13 are not panel water areas.
That's correct.
Okay.
Could I just add one other thing to that as well?
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that regardless of who is operationalizing test fisheries as far as some day-to-day activities, the schedule that you brought up early of these starts and end times of the planned test fisheries is done through the Fraser River panel. It's done bilaterally. There's a lot of discussion that goes into setting up these schedules. They're schedules as planned, and there's a number of footnotes on the actual schedule that talks about that they will be maybe terminated based upon different abundances and how the run's migrated. You have to adjust depending on what actually returns. So they're more of a guide than an actual we start and end on these dates. My point is that there's a lot of discussion between the parties about what's needed to do the stock assessment in each one of the years. And as Jim was talking about, historically, the test fisheries that were done in non-panel waters were operated by DFO, and the ones in the panel waters were operated by the PSC. But starting in 2007, the test fisheries were operated by the PSC with a lot of input from DFO staff as well about the schedules and the timing and how they would operate. I think I'd like to add as well that there's some guidance on how these would operate. That's a policy document as well that's on policy approaches for interim adjustments and strategies. That provides guidance to all test fisheries that occur in Canada about the disposition of fish and ensuring that we're conforming with that LAROC decision and what that disposition of fish are.
I'd like to move to the use of the data that is collected from the test fisheries, and again back to Mr. Cave. We've talked a bit about the fact that fish go to the DNA lab in Nanaimo and the scales come to the PSC. What kind of analysis is actually done on the fish when they go to their different labs, and what kind of analysis is done by your group with that data once it's received by you?
Okay, thank you. I'll speak just very briefly on the analysis of the biological data that come to our office, and we collect length and sex and scales. The scales are read for age of the returning fish, and that's work that is processed in part for production analysis as well as other things. But the DNA analysis is done. It's a fairly involved work. I'm not an expert on that, but the purpose of the DNA analysis is to, using microsatellite DNA, is to identify the likely stock of origin of the individual fish in the mixture. And there's a series of statistical models that are used to do that. Once that work is done, our geneticist reviews those results and may make adjustments to those once he receives them. And that's just set aside for the moment. We collect also the catch per unit effort data. So in the morning we collate all those data, the catches, the effort, which is in the case of seines, is the number of sets that have been made. In the case of gillnet, it's a calculation of the average soak time times the length of the net, expressed in 1,000 fathom minutes, and with the goal to get the catch per unit effort. And in the case of the DNA data, it's applied to either catch data or to the CPUE data, and also to the mission hydroacoustics data, so that we're not interested just in Fraser sockeye, but we're interested in the stocks of origin of those at any given point in time, at any given location within our sphere of management. So in the case of if we had a catch per effort of 1,000 per set in area 20, if we had a stock composition that indicated 50% choco in that, we would estimate the catch per effort uniquely for Choco River sockeye, or the summer run complex as a whole. And it's on the basis of that where we then make our assessments. As part of our assessments, we also evaluate catchability or expansion line, which is the catchability is the proportion that is removed from the population from a defined unit of effort. And the combination of the catch per effort by stock and historical measures of catchability are what we use to estimate the abundance in the marine areas.
Okay, so maybe you can just go through that description of catchability a little slower and kind of maybe give some examples of how that works, because it's a different concept.
Well, let's say we had a catch per effort on a given day of 1,000, and you had a million fish going by. The catch per effort of 1,000 divided by a million fish in the migration for that day would be the catchability. So it's 1,000 divided by a million.
Okay. And how do you determine the million fish? Is that using mission data?
Well, that would be based on reconstructions, run reconstructions. Now you can calculate catchability and expansion line for any defined period. It could be an annual estimate, and so it would be summing up the catch per effort for the entire year through an approach or combination of approaches and dividing it by the total abundance that would have migrated through those areas during the course of that time.
And are some of these calculations done not at the end of the year, but during the season to
Yes.
project what the run size will be?
Well, we typically work with historical data, but we also look to see if there are deviations in season from the historical data. So if we have 6 days of data, we try and project the 6 days of fish en route for a given complex of stocks. Let's say it's the summer run stocks. Later, we reconstruct the run to mission once all those fish have reached or passed mission, and then we will look to see if that catchability, or the inverse of that, the expansion line, is consistent with what we were using. If there's a compelling reason to change, we may change, but generally we work with the long-term historical averages.
Okay. Is there uncertainty in
Ms.
that
Baker?
analysis? Yes?
I wonder if I could just, so I can follow this evidence, ask if you could have this witness explain to me what he's talking about in the context of the evidence we've already heard up to this point, which is the forecasting evidence, total available catch, and so on. He's talking about something called catchability, which I had not heard before.
Okay.
So I'm trying to put this in the context of several days of evidence we've already heard around forecasting and run size assessment and those kinds of things. The other, a couple of things that would be helpful just to lay the groundwork for me so I can follow this is two things. One, what is a test fishery? In other words, what are the protocols for this? And secondly, we've heard a lot about the wild salmon policy and CUs, and you're still talking about stocks. I'm just wondering if you could explain to me whether you're talking about CUs when you talk about the data that you require, or you're talking about something different.
Okay, so there's three areas there. The first, let me just quickly make a note of those. Well, first of all, test fisheries, I think that's outlined in the first document we took you to, but if you, maybe you could give just an overview of what a test fishery is, what the purpose is in the program.
A test fishery is a small, a test fishery is what we use to understand what is swimming by. We don't know what the abundance of fish is on any given day. It's our goal to find the abundance of fish that are migrating or expected to migrate past mission. And we don't know what that number is. So we collect data, we fish on the run, and we take samples from the population, from the run. So a vessel will go out, he'll complete his test fishery, that individual might catch 300 fish for the night. It's our goal to try and find out what that 300 fish means. And we do that based on looking at past years, historical database that in the case of some of these goes back some 50 years, to understand what the proportion of the fish that are caught. We try and relate that to the population as a whole. We don't catch the whole population, we only catch a very, very small amount. So what we're doing with the catch per effort data is we're expanding it to the abundance that's moving by. So catchability is the proportion that's removed from the run. If you turn it around, you can expand that catch per effort to the abundance. So we talk about catch expansion lines, and catchability is just simply the inverse of the expansion line. Test fisheries are operated, they're approved by the panel. They run regardless of whether there's a TAC or not. That separates them from other fisheries. They're kind of a cost of collecting data.
The results from the test fishery help to establish whether there will be a TAC made available. Is that fair?
Eventually, yes.
Okay.
They are part of that information. So we have the mission hydroacoustics, the daily passage at mission, and I think Mike Lapointe showed you those graphs, those run timing graphs, which compared to the preseason forecast. So there were normal distributions of abundance, expected run timing, expected abundance, and what we try and do is understand the progress of that migration in time during the season. So we have a run through mission that might be, say, through July 31st. We have data through mission, we're drawing that curve, and then the next 6 days come from the test fisheries. They're more uncertain than the hydroacoustics data, but they are, we're trying to look seaward, because if we do, we get a better understanding of the run as it progresses.
All right. So,
Maybe I could add a few words
Sure.
as well, if that would help.
Yeah.
It would be helpful maybe if we brought the map back up that shows where these test fisheries
sure.
operate.
I think that's just 2 pages, like 408 backwards there.
So while that map is coming up, just linking them back to maybe some of the other evidence you've heard earlier, is that we have a preseason forecast that starts off giving us some idea of what could return in any one particular year. However, there's a lot of variability around that preseason forecast, and as the fish start returning, they don't always hit the same area of the Pacific coast. They could return and make landfall further up around Haida Gwaii. They could also hit landfall much further down around Vancouver Island. It's really going to depend on oceanographic conditions. Regardless, we run what we've called test fisheries. These are very integral to gathering in season information, whether it be how the timing of the run's returning. We have forecasts in those as well. We also want to know how many fish are coming down through Johnson Strait, and also how many are coming through Juan de Fuca. And we want to know what those pedigree of those fish are, whether they, and that's what the stock ID provides us. Jim was using the word stock ID. The DNA gives us a very discrete understanding of what those groups of fish are and what lakes they're returning to. But the other part of that is we do roll that up into management groups, is how we manage the fisheries in season, not by conservation units. The test fisheries provide us all this information, and as Jim was indicating, they occur whether there is an attack occurring or not. This is how important they are to gather this information. Without this information, we would be, I would not say totally blind, but we would be missing how we would conduct fisheries in season and make decisions to manage those fisheries. They're also linked to the Mission Hydroacoustic as well, which is gets into this expansion area where there's fish, when we test fish in Johnson Strait, and also in Area 20, Juan de Fuca. We only sample a small part of the population, and so you have to expand it into what we think that abundance is. And then you can link that back to how many fish are estimated as they migrate past Mission, which is giving a total daily estimate of fish that are migrating upriver. You can take those accounts and make some adjustments that Jim and his staff does to say how many fish are between where we caught fish in Johnson Strait and also in Juan de Fuca Strait, and expand it into that block as they migrate into the river before they hit Mission. So there's some uncertainty there, but we want to know what that total magnitude is from those test fisheries, and that's where the expansion lines come in that Jim was talking about. So I guess I probably repeat myself on this, but these test fisheries are very important to the operation of Pacific Salmon Commission operations, and that we view these, as Jim mentioned as well, they operate without TAC. We will make decisions on whether we need to curtail them or not, because we're concerned about stocks. It could be Fraser sockeye, it could be cultus, it could be other stocks that we identify each year. But nonetheless, without those, we would be having a challenge to know what the actual returns are each year. And these are operated under a Section 52 license, which is different than a commercial license. And so there's a difference of licensing that goes on with these test fisheries as well.
Mr. Cave identified initially, and that is done on that schedule. Every day that is set to be fished is fished, whether or not there's fish in the water, unless there's a conservation concern like you identified earlier. And is that correct?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, that's correct. Unless there's a commercial fishery operating, those test fisheries operate. So others operate on a schedule of 2 or 3 days a week. But
Right.
the principal ones, the marine area gillnet, the marine area seine, and the in-river gillnet test fisheries operate daily unless there's commercial fishing operating.
And the idea, in part at least, is to identify what the size of the run is as it moves through the marine areas heading towards Mission, to allow fisheries to open in those marine areas.
That's correct.
Okay.
I should clarify one thing. I said that we don't operate the same test. We don't operate those test fisheries if there's a commercial fishery on. In fact, under the ITQ, we have been operating those test fisheries during the course of the ITQ fishery.
Okay. And the further away from Mission these test fisheries happen, the more opportunity there is to fish between that test fishery and the Mission site. Is that also fair?
I think it's perhaps fair to say that if there are commercial locations in between those areas, then there would be commercial opportunities taken should there be an opportunity identified by either the run strength of the run through the panel or through decisions by Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
All right. And if I can ask you to, Mr. Dunn, to put up in the same document that you're in the same exhibit, tab or page 170 shows an example of some of the an illustration of the data that's presented to the panels further down.
Slightly off a little.
Yeah, my numbers are different than yours. There we go.
Yeah, these graphs are useful.
Okay,
Perhaps
so-
we can move down a little bit further.
Yeah, go down the third
Okay,
one.
yeah.
So for example, when you're at Mission, you know through the calculations that are done at Mission, you have an estimate of what the run size is. When you're out in the marine areas and you're receiving test fishing information, this allows you to get a projection 6 days before Mission of what the anticipated run size is. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay.
And so if you look at these graphs here, and perhaps the best one to look at here is the early summer run migration. You've got these normal distributions. The top dotted line is the 50% P level forecast. The next one down, normal curve, is a 75 P forecast. And then that solid line is what we're projecting the migration to be in season. The last 6 days on that line, which I presume would go to about the 31st of July, the last 6 days would be based on marine test fishing. It would be catch per effort times expansion line equals the estimated abundance, and we sum it up for both routes. So you can see that those marine test fisheries are telling you that you haven't got the run on the early summer run migration. It's just confirming. If you didn't have those, you would not know, you'd be blind in between Area 20 and Mission.
And just you said there you sum up both routes. That means you're taking data from the test fisheries in Johnson Strait and data from test fisheries in Strait of Juan de Fuca and combining that information to give you the full run size.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
And just to go back to a question the Commissioner had, as you said, the 75P and the 50P forecast lines, which are those normal distributions you see in dotted, those are references to the preseason forecast expectations.
That's correct, plus the timing.
Just to address what the Commissioner has asked, I know that you touched on it, Mr. Royal, saying that you manage management groups, not to CUs, but I take it the data that is retrieved from the samples is data which would be relevant to a CU analysis. Is that fair?
Well, they can be, but the DNA is, while very extremely useful, the sample size is only 100 individuals. So when you start trying to narrow these things down to smaller and smaller stocks at the CU level, you start to lose resolution. Mm-hmm. So really, once you start getting below 5% in the sample, there's a lot more uncertainty about that estimate that just relates to sampling efficiencies.
Would you agree with me then, to have a better idea of what CUs are passing by, you'd actually have to catch a whole lot more fish than and keep and retain and analyze a whole lot more fish than what's being kept and retained now?
That would be correct, and also the associated costs that go with analyzing those DNA samples at $20 a fish.
Okay.
With the wild salmon policy, I mean, when you start getting into these small stocks, it's the needle in the haystack. You know, it's trying to find to identify them.
Okay.
Now, sometimes you can find indications of them, but
Just to, again, hopefully this is helpful, but you've talked about two things, expansion lines and catchability. Expansion lines is a function that you use based on historical data, kind of projecting forward to estimate what the run size is. Is that right?
that's correct.
And that happens in season.
That's correct.
And the catchability analysis that you described, that's a post-season calculation, or it's after the run's complete and you have actual data. Is that fair?
We've been using the term expansion line because it's easier for people to understand that you take a number and you multiply it by another number, and you get abundance. It's more correct scientifically to, for a number of different reasons, to actually work with the term catchability, which in a loose sense is the inverse of that. So that's the proportion of the population that is removed by your fishing operation. Okay, and I think as we start to get more rigorous approaches in analyzing different models, statistical models that define the relationship between catch per effort and abundance, it's more appropriate to work with catchabilities. And I think we just need to go through that education process. And some of this rigorous analysis that we're doing in a Bayesian context, where we're actually evaluating this and evaluating model uncertainty, parameter uncertainty, all of those key items. It really is a better way to do that is with the analyzing catchability in the historical context.
And those uncertainties that you mentioned in the Bayesian analysis that you're doing, has that been implemented now? Has the PSC made some efforts to incorporate that uncertainty analysis into run projections in season?
Yes, absolutely. It's work that Catherine Mickelson's, myself, and Keith Forrest have been working on. That work is ongoing, and it probably will continue for as long as we manage Fraser River Sockeye. It's continually updating what you do, how you do it, the sorts of models you would use as you get more data.
All right. Now, in terms of the importance of test fishing data for the panel and managing the sockeye or the fisheries, you've talked quite a bit about run size as being an important outcome for the test fishing results and stock ID. Is there also does it also have a role in understanding the diversion rate, or the number of fish that are going down Johnson Strait versus the number of fish that are going on the outside of Vancouver Island?
Yes, it does. We look at the catch per effort data from both approaches, and we make an estimate of diversion rate based on that. We use both seine data and gillnet data with the appropriate catchabilities applied.
And migration timing, I think we've touched on as well, but just to identify that clearly, that's an important component also.
Yes. You get an earlier estimate of timing, an earlier estimate of run size than you would if you did not have those data available and all you had was mission. It had an improved run size estimate and performance.
And is test fishing data published in the industry as it comes in season?
We make those results available daily in a daily report, and they can be accessed either daily or you can download a test fishery for the entire year. You can download it either Adobe Acrobat or by Excel if people want to do their own analysis.
Right. And Mr. Asu, is there does the industry use test fishing data as it comes in season?
Yes. I guess the simplest is industry, I guess, is looking at what the overall run size is and trying to plan for whatever they're going to be doing as far as fisheries.
And do First Nations use test fishing data in planning their FSC harvests?
Yes, we do. Typically, what we try to do, at least at home, is watch for when there is an abundance starting to occur in Area 12 so that we can start our food fishery. It's just far more cost effective to be there while there is an abundance to harvest rather than working on the low abundance. And in recent years, I guess we've been constrained up in the strait by the what do you call it, Sakino, which has sort of delayed our timing. So our timing has been pushed back, and so it's sort of been bookended the same as industry.
All right. So it has usefulness in terms of the people who manage the fisheries, but it also has usefulness for people who are hoping to conduct their own fisheries.
Yes.
Is there any other importance? Have I covered everything that is important about test fishing data, or is there anything to add that I haven't covered? I'd like to move on to funding and implementation. First of all, in implementing the test fishing programs, who actually conducts the fisheries and who administers the contracts? How is it actually done, implemented?
Are you asking that question of me or Paul?
I'm asking that question of the panel, but why don't we start with you, Mr. Cave, and then people can chime in if they've got something to add.
Well, under the current environment we're under, we have dialogues with Canada and let them know what after consultation with the panel, what our schedule would be, and try and make an estimate of the costs that would be required to run these test fisheries. And if we try and make an estimate of what our realistic catch would be under these scenarios, and identify our required funding over and above that. Panel-approved test fisheries are operated out of our office. The contract is between ourselves and the test fishing individual involved. In terms of actually administering the day-to-day operations, we ensure that there's observers on board those boats, that the sampling equipment is there.
Sorry, observers from the Salmon Commission?
Yes, either the Pacific Salmon Commission, or in the case of the Johnson Straits test fisheries, in their instance, they actually have to pay for the observers from their part of the contract.
Your question is about who administers the test fisheries and how do we plan for them? Was it the two parts?
Yep.
Okay. So there's a series of steps that are undertaken each year as far as developing a test fishing plan. It really starts back in, I would say, January of the year thereabouts, or even maybe a bit earlier, through the Fraser panel process, that a draft test fishing plan would be put together and presented to the panel about what may be required that year. A lot of it is based upon history, but will be modified by what we know at that time about how things may occur and what constraints there may be, whether it be budgetary or whether it be stock constraints that may also constrain the test fishing plan. It'll go through a series of iterations and discussions about what test fisheries are needed and how they would operate in the starts and end times. There's also a financial and administration committee of the Pacific Salmon Commission. It's a subcommittee that reports to the commission. There needs to be joint agreement between Canada and the U.S. on the what's agreed. The F&A committee, for short, will get input from the Fraser panel about what the test fishing plan is and what sort of budget requirements may be required from each party. These will change each year. What I mean, these will change, I mean the parties' contributions could change each year, and in recent years it's been Canada that's been contributing financial money to the operation of test fisheries within Canadian waters, whether it be within panel or non-panel. And within the U.S. waters, the test fisheries have operated as much as they have as far as generating income to pay for those services through the use of fish. Within Canada, Canada provides a contribution to the PSC. There's a joint project agreement, JPA for short, that's put together between Canada and DFO for short, and the Pacific Salmon Commission, that outlines the work plan, the agreed upon work plan, who's going to be responsible for what test fisheries operate, provides a guide about when those test fisheries will start and stop, and what the contributions are of each of the parties, whether it be money that's transferred from DFO to the PSC or in-kind support as well. So I guess there's a few steps in this whole process of coming up with an agreed upon test fish plan that generally is concluded by, I would say, late May or May of each year, or it could be into June. I think one of the memos you brought up earlier here showed June, I think, on the date. So you start with a draft. It goes through the Fraser panel. The F&A committee as well needs to understand what there could be any financial obligations between the parties, and then make a recommendation to the commission. And then that test fishing is approved. And as I was talking about earlier, it will modify each year depending on how these stocks actually, how Fraser sockeye and pink salmon return. I mentioned pink salmon because every second year, every odd year, we have pink salmon as well that we need to monitor, and this could as well increase the duration of the test fishery as well. And that's why these times all change. And as Jim was talking about earlier, the stock makeup of Fraser sockeye changes each year, which also then impacts upon what test fisheries you need and what duration of those test fisheries are going to occur. And as those return each year, you're going to make adjustments.
That would be the PSC enters into those contracts?
Yes, we do.
And Mr. Asu, you're an example of a person who administers a PSC test fishing agreement every year?
Yes.
And do you typically have new people coming on board doing the test fisheries every year, or do you have a set group that you have used over and over for years?
It's our preference that we keep working with the same individuals. In the case of Johnstone Straits, these are basically put up to tender every 5 years as part of what has always occurred under the DFO running of those test fisheries, and that was again done again. What year was that, Brian?
I think 2 years ago.
And then basically we still have the same individuals involved in those test fisheries, even though it went to tender. But in the case of the panel area test fisheries, if an individual is doing a good job, we prefer to stay with them because it just controls one variable in the variation. Not everybody fishes the same way, no matter how hard you try to do that. There are individual differences, and so we try and stay with the same individual for the longer term if we can.
Okay. And in terms of I'm going to get into the funding in a bit more detail, but has there been a change since the LaRock decision in terms of how these contracts are administered by the PSC? For panel and non-panel waters?
Certainly, I think the biggest change is how they're funded. Once we start fishing, it's pretty much as we always have. I mean, we have to fish the same way. Otherwise, it changes our database, our long-term database. So you can't decide, well, we're going to cut back to 3 sets and pay somebody less. You have to basically run that test fishery the same way. That's what the data, for the integrity, to preserve the integrity of the data, that's what has to be done.
All right, well, let's move then to funding and LaRock, because that has a big significance for test fishing. First of all, Mr. Ryle, how did Department of Fisheries and Oceans pay for test fisheries prior to the LaRock decision in 2006?
Prior to 2006, it was through use of fish, meaning that we'd plan test fisheries as we've done pre or post LaRock. There's really been no change to planning those. But the actual vehicle for paying for those services pre-LaRock was through harvesting fish to compensate the test fishermen for providing those services.
So the test fishers were able to keep the fish and sell the fish that they caught.
That's correct. That's what I mean by use of fish.
Okay.
And there are some policies that were put in place to guide how that would all operate under use of fish as well.
All right. And did the excuse me, department contribute some funds for salaries or administrative costs, or was everything paid for by Fish?
No, the department as well would be having staff that were paid by, A-based dollars, departmental dollars, and providing technical support to operate those test fisheries as well, and providing funds for operations of collection and of those samples as well.
All right, and in the U.S. test fisheries, is that still the model that's employed?
That's my understanding, but Jim can correct me if I'm wrong.
I missed the question. I heard part of it, but not all of it.
I was asking how Canada paid for test fisheries prior to LaRock, and Mr. Rowell explained that the fishers were allowed to keep and sell the fish they caught.
Mm-hmm. But you were asking me the question under the U.S.?
Yeah, the U.S. administered, or not U.S. administered, but the test fisheries that are in U.S. waters still paid for on that same model?
Pretty much, yes. Yeah.
But the bulk of the test fisheries are in Canadian water, is that right?
That's correct.
And now, Mr. Rowell, since the ROC, how does Canada pay for test fisheries?
Well, the test fisheries have been paid primarily through DFO funds. I say primarily in the first year in 2007, post the 2006 LaRock decision. The U.S. as well contributed about $200,000 in 2007 to operation of test fisheries. And since 2007, so for 08, 9, and 10, there is, and in 07 as well, there was a JPA, the Joint Project Agreement, that transferred funds once there was agreed upon test fishing plan to the PSC to operate test fisheries. And those amounts varied depending on what that test fishing plan amounted. I think it was probably in the order of 2007 of about 450,000, 500,000, and then thereafter about 700 to 800,000.
Okay. Well, we'll get into those details in a minute, so you don't have to stretch your memory on that. I think I've got a document that'll help you with that. Are fish sales relied on at all currently to fund test fisheries?
Well, it depends what you mean relied upon. There is, under the JPA, there are funds provided to PSC to operate those test fisheries. There's guidance in a policy document that outlines what fish can be retained and what has to be released. And really the operating principle here in that policy is that anything that can be released and has a high probability, and specifically it says 50% or greater probability of survival must be released. And so really the red face test, as we might call it, is can those fish be released and will they survive? That's the first thing that needs to be determined. So on the purse seine test fisheries, you can take your sample and release those fish and they will survive, or a high majority of them will. They'll swim over the cork line and fish will be counted out and off they go. On the gillnet test fisheries, though, that's not the case. There is a high mortality rate and all those fish are retained, and the disposition of those fish is up to the who is authorized under the Section 52 license to do with those fish what they will. They can be sold, they can be used for other purposes, but in the case of what we're talking about here, for a good part of those fish, or maybe even all of them, are sold, and there's value attached to those.
Okay. And how is that accounted for somehow in the payment to test fishers?
Well, there are contracts that are entered into, but I don't negotiate the contracts. They're negotiated through the PSC with, as Jim was talking about, of what the services are and what will be done each day and how they'll be compensated.
Right. So, Mr. Cave, if you've got...
All fishermen, all fishers are paid a charter rate, a daily charter rate. It's not expressed in fish. If there are fish that are sold as part of the test fishing sampling, those are used to fund part of the operation.
When the within Pownal Waters, does the PSC actually receive and sell fish that are caught under the test fishing program, or do the fishers sell their retained fish, and is that accounted for in the funds they're paid, or how does it work?
I believe the licenses are issued to, I need clarification on this. But what I will tell you is that in panel area waters, we enter into an agreement with the buyers, the Pacific Salmon Commission does.
All right.
Those fish are sold and we handle those monies.
Okay.
That's a different approach to what happens in non-panel area waters, because there's more buyers involved, and it's just a carryover. We tried to do it our way one year, and it was messy, and we felt the fishermen had a better handle on things. So,
So the Salmon Commission pays the fishers. The Salmon Commission receives proceeds from any fish that were sold
that's correct.
in panel waters.
That's correct.
And outside of panel waters, maybe Mr. Asu, how is it administered from your perspective?
As far as the sale of the samples,
Yep.
well, the sale is done by us, and I guess at the end of the season, what happens is whatever's owed to you, that sale is deducted, and then the difference is paid by the Salmon Commission.
Right. Okay.
That's my understanding as well.
Okay. Mr. Ryle, after the LaRock decision came down in 2002, did the department do a review of all of the test fishing programs in Canada?
Yeah, after it came down, the LaRock decision came down in 2006. In the fall of 2006, there was a national working group put together that wanted to see what programs were operated across Canada that would be affected by that decision. I was a member of that working group, as I mentioned earlier this morning, in the fall of 2006. And one of my main tasks in that working group was to get in touch with all people across Canada that ran various programs that would be impacted by the decision about use of fish and not being authorized, the minister not having the authority to use fish to run programs like that. And what sort of what sort of changes might we have to undertake?
And that is the LaRock working group, is that right?
That's my memory of the name.
And who was the LaRock working group going to report to, or who did they report to once this review was completed?
It was in Science Branch. It reported to the ADM of Science, and the ADM of Science made a presentation to DMC, Departmental Management Committee, November the 1st of 2006, outlining what the national programs that would be affected.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, just before we started this morning, I was given a document that was from Canada that was produced for that meeting, which I haven't had a chance to review because it just came in right before we started. So I wonder if we could take the morning break now. I could look through this document and we could continue.
There was a reference just a few minutes ago. Mr. Ryle may have referenced it, but it's he talked about an agreement between DFO and the PSC, and he gave an overview of that agreement, what it contains. And then other agreements have been referred to, that is the agreements between PSC and those that they contract with. But I just wondered whether you have either already referred to or you're going to refer to these different agreements.
You actually put those agreements into evidence?
Well, I don't know. The agreement that Mr. Ryle referred to when he talked about an agreement between the DFO and the PSC.
That's the joint project agreement?
Well, I don't know if that's what he was referring to or not.
Yes, that's what I was referring to, the joint project agreement.
Is that an annual agreement?
It's an annual agreement between the two parties, yes.
I see. And is that what you're referring to now, Ms. Baker?
That was what I just asked you if you were referring to. That's the agreement that is done between the two organizations to set out the terms of the administration of the test fishing program.
Is that in evidence already?
It's not in evidence.
Oh, I
no.
see.
And then there would be individual contracts with individual fishers to implement on a local basis each of those test fishing programs.
But you're coming to that agreement, is that the plan? or-
I wasn't going to put that into evidence, but I know that Canada was wanting to put that into evidence. I can certainly raise it with them now if that's helpful to you. I didn't think it needed to be in evidence, but we can certainly put it in.
I was just trying to keep track of these
Yeah.
different agreements they're talking about, and
Yep.
just to understand the entire context of how these agreements are worked out, and then the implications for those agreements across the process of the test fishery.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll take the morning break.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.